Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us again today. Today, we're going to be speaking to Paul Vissian, who is experienced in the question of mindfulness. It's something that we've covered in podcasts previously, and also there are some articles in the read section of the website. But I thought it might be interesting and helpful to have Paul come and talk to us a little bit about mindfulness, what it is, and how we can integrate it into our days. Morning, Paul. Thanks so much for coming to speak to us today.
Morning, Leanne, and thanks for inviting me.
No, we're grateful to have you. Paul, can you just start, please, by telling our audience a little bit about you and what your experience is and how you teach mindfulness to others?
Sure, thanks. So I started, I guess my interest in mindfulness come about around 10 years ago when I started to study as an executive coach. And as part of that development journey, one of the things that you start to realize is becoming very aware of yourself, but also the people you're coaching, and in terms of really tuning into emotionally what's going on for them and the challenges, but also the opportunities that they want to achieve. And so through the start of that journey, I started to study. My coach, supervisor, was a mindfulness teacher, and he would use it as a grounding practice at the start of sessions to get people really present in the session, to make the most of that time. And that's when my practice started. And then I spent a number of years practicing, which is built, and then to do a more intensive course specifically in mindfulness. And I've been practicing now for over 8 years.
That was a fantastic idea, to do a mindfulness grounding session before moving on to learn something. I mean, I suppose whatever it is that you're planning to learn, actually physically and mentally bringing yourself back into the present moment must really excel the learning process.
Absolutely. I think, you know, whether it's a learning activity or whether you're going into an important meeting, many people dash into a meeting and our mind's quite busy with what we was doing before or thinking about what we need to do afterwards. And actually, we're only partly paying attention. We're not fully present, and we almost then take some time to catch up. So whilst we might feel that we're productive, we're doing lots of things, actually our thinking is quite fragmented. And sorry to break the myth, but you know, not even women can multitask, unfortunately. What happens to men and women is our brain switches very quickly between tasks, but we become less effective. And it also has, you know, wider effects as well.
So Paul, help our listeners with and our viewers with an explanation of what mindfulness actually is, because of course we hear about it all the time in the press now. It's becoming a bit of a buzzword, isn't it? But not everyone really understands what it is and the benefits that it can bring. Help us with that.
Yeah, and it's a great question, because I think it has become popularized, and I think in one sense that's really positive. But I think also there's a risk that people feel that it's a fad. You know, is this kind of very much a hippie tree hugging type idea that really doesn't make any difference. So firstly, to answer the first part of that question, it's not about emptying your mind of everything or stopping your mind. That's not what minds do. But it's really about paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And it's those aspects of really stopping ourselves to pay attention to what's happening at this moment in time, and non-judgmentally, because we can be very self-critical, and that's also not helpful. So with people that I've worked with around mindfulness, the two things that people come back with: one, usually I can't find enough time, and it only needs to be a small amount of time. And the second thing is, well, I just can't do it because my mind's too busy. My mind wanders off onto different things whilst I'm trying to do it. And what I tell people is that that's not a mistake. If you have a mind, your mind will wander. Actually, if you imagine going to the gym where you're working the muscle, you don't see the results immediately, but you go back, because if you do that over a period of months, then you'll start to see a change. And it's the same with our mind. Every single time our mind wanders off, if we're paying attention and we gently, kindly bring it back to what we're trying to focus on. So a common anchor would be to focus on our breath. And if we bring our attention back to our breath, at that point, we're developing that muscle. And it's fine if the mind wanders off 100 times. We just bring it back 100 times in a gentle, kind way. And that's part of that practice. So that's a common misunderstanding. The other part of mindfulness has been around for actually over 1,000 years. There's Buddhist monks that have practiced mindfulness meditation for centuries and centuries. Now in the Western world, it's developed over a number of years, and it's become more popular. And that's because we really like to have evidence-based research that really supports this, rather than it just feels like it's the right thing to do. So within the US, John Kabat-Zinn was one of the, I guess, founding thinkers in the Western world, and he completed his research in clinical trials in the US, and he was dealing with patients that had chronic depression. And his controlled studies, which meet the gold standard, actually showed that regular practice, a daily practice over an 8-week period of mindfulness, was more effective at managing depression than any of the medications that were available on the market at the time. And not only was it more effective in helping people with depression, they was much less likely to have a relapse as a result, which can be a common process through medication. When the medication stops, people tend to relapse, whereas with meditation, this actually would have longer lasting effects. So a wealth of other people have since done research and studies. The number of research papers continues to build. So there's a number of aspects. There's this part around the physical mindfulness meditation, but actually, in a more broad sense, there's other aspects of being mindful in how we live and how we work. And so that mindfulness process will underpin that. But we can go out for a mindful walk, and we start noticing more things. We can eat a meal mindfully, and what we start to notice is that we have we notice the textures, the flavors, the taste. Even if we do something as simple as to drink our first cup of tea or coffee in the morning, if we hold the cup and feel the sensation of the warmth of the cup, the smell and the aroma of the tea or the coffee, and if we really then notice the first mouthful, we'll start to notice things that we've never noticed before, and how it differs from the second mouthful and the third mouthful. So all of these things we start paying much more attention to.
You mentioned the mindfulness meditation, Paul. Are mindfulness and meditation the same thing, or are they different things?
Yeah, there's many types of meditation. Usually within a mindfulness meditation, you will be following a guided process. So a common one would be either following the flow of your own breath. It may be something called a body scan, which is where we really focus on certain aspects of our body and the sensations that we're feeling in that moment in time. So again, there's no special or right way to feel. And this can be done sitting in a chair. So we may notice the contact of our feet on the ground, the sensations in our toes. It may be tingling, numbness, or absence of feeling. But it's really giving us something to focus on. And then we can work our way through our body. And this is this important part. It's not about emptying our mind, because that's very difficult to try to do. Your mind immediately wanders to something, but if we're paying attention to something that's here in that present moment, it gives us an anchor. And whether that's a sensation in our body, it can also be listening to sounds, focusing on sounds outside the room, inside the room. It can be, as I say, just simply following the flow of our breath, not breathing in any special way, but recognizing each in-breath is followed by an out-breath. So there may be other aspects and other types of meditation, but usually you would find that you would have a guided meditation around what's happening in the present moment. So it's really about the present moment. And on top of that, particularly with stress and anxiety, sometimes you may have a guided meditation around loving kindness or gratitude, which again are very powerful and proven through research to really shift how people feel, and to have physiological benefits, because it changes the physiology, easy for me to say, of how our body reacts. Because we all notice little things. If we're feeling a bit stressed and tense, one thing that may happen is we might feel that tension in our shoulders lift slightly, and then we hold that, and that tension then tends to build, and this will affect, the chemicals within our body and how we respond.
I was going to ask you actually about because having read a number of the research papers, and as you say, the number of research papers has expanded exponentially, hasn't it, over the last few years? I think probably you're right, driven by the desire for the Western world to have some evidence-based research, whereas Eastern philosophies have just understood that this kind of thing works for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so we have research papers, but they're very helpful, I think, in underpinning the understanding of how mindfulness can affect the body and the mind and the chemical composition in the body. That help us with how does mindfulness change us physically and mentally and emotionally?
So the two things quite significant from a research perspective. One is the piece of research completed by Michael Chalskelson, so the author of Mindfulness in 8 Weeks, and it's deliberately 8 weeks because that's based around the research. Michael completed research with US Marines in Afghanistan and Iraq, so in a very high, stressful, intense environment, and again through a controlled group. So part of a troop completing mindfulness for 12 minutes a day. So not significant, 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. And the difference that they reported from previous tours, the ones that had completed the mindfulness program, so they felt much calmer, they felt more focused, they felt much more aware of what was happening around them, and they felt much more in control. Whereas previously, comments such as feeling jittery, feeling so amped up, so ready to go in that environment. And, what one individual said, thank God nothing happened, but I was on that point where you are holding the trigger and ready to go. So a significant change. But the really interesting thing about the 8 weeks, 12 minutes mindfulness meditation over 8 weeks, physically starts to change the structure of our brain. So the fMRI scans have shown that the grey matter, which is essential for our brain, actually increases. And some longitudinal studies that have been done over 25 years, where people have practiced mindfulness for 25 years versus people that haven't, there's been signs where the brain aging process is a difference of 10 years over that.
That's astonishing, isn't it? That's really astonishing.
And that's a physical change. But as we know, physically with our body, that we need to provide it with nutrients, we need to rest. And if we do that, then our body renews itself and it becomes stronger. And it's exactly the same with our mind. What we're allowing our mind to do is to rest and actually repair itself. Whereas if we're living quite frantically and we're having poor sleep and our mind's continuously busy, we're not allowing it. What it actually does is it diminishes our working memory capacity. And we may all notice this from time. So that if we become where we're really, really busy, and we start to feel a little bit stressed, then we become stressed about all the things we have to do, but also we might start to critique ourselves around, well, I'm more likely to forget something. And we might notice then the influence in our behavior, where we start to become a bit more impatient, we become a bit shorter, our temper starts to change. And what's happening is we don't have the capacity, the working memory to regulate our emotions, and we need working memory and capacity to be able to process how am I feeling right now, and what's driving that, and how do I want to respond? But when we really feel like we're living on the edge and we're really, really busy, then the greatest challenge that we have is starting to manage those emotions. And also, we don't particularly make good decisions if we're very stressed. And we lose our creativity. To be creative, you need to access the part of the brain that can deal with our problem solving, the neocortex. So if you imagine your brain, if you put the thumb into the middle of your palm and wrap your fingers over the top, the neocortex is your fingers wrapped across the top. This is our most newly developed part of our brain. But the thumb is the limbic system. This is the part that Professor Steve Peters refers to in his book, The Chimp Paradox, our inner chimp. And from the start of evolution, it plays an important role. It's there to keep us safe and so that we can survive. But unfortunately, our brain responds now. If we have a load of emails come in, how we respond to that is just the same way as at the start of evolution, as if we're going to be chased by a wild animal. And if we're going to be chased by a wild animal, the limbic region would take control. And what it's trying to do is, how do I stay safe? And this controls our fight, flight, and freeze mechanism. But it's also quite clever, because what happens if we feel threatened, so a stimulus, we see something that's threatening, we hear something that's threatening, it releases neurochemicals such as cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. So cortisol is often referred to as the stress hormone. And as your body becomes flooded with this, it actually slows down the neocortex, because it doesn't want you to use that problem-solving part of the brain that's more complex. It wants you to get ready to fight, or to flee, or to freeze. Now, in a life-threatening situation, that's useful. But actually in our day-to-day lives, if we feel those same stresses, our body's responding in the same way. So it's not allowing us to access this neocortex, the part we need for problem solving, innovation, and creativity. And cortisol will stay in your system for up to 48 hours. And that's why if you're genuinely threatened, you get ready to fight. By using that physical activity, we will remove that from our system. So as well as these stress hormones and neurochemicals, that we can manage this by, such as mindfulness practice will encourage the production of oxytocin, serotonin, and vasopressin. So these neurochemicals are all of the chemicals that are connected with making us feel calm and connected. And that's why many people will know oxytocin, particularly mothers that have given birth. With breastfeeding, we produce more oxytocin. Actually, cuddling a child can also produce more oxytocin. It's a sense of being connected as social creatures. This has a calming effect on our body. So it's not, some people say, well, it's kind of all in our mind, but actually how we think and how we feel physically changes the chemical reactions in our body. And we can get into a cycle. So if I feel stressed, then I might think about what's worrying me, and that will affect my body, and it will then affect my behavior. And then if I feel the tension in my shoulders and the tightness in my chest, I then start to think, well, I'm now worried about this tightness in my chest. And then I start to feel more worried and more anxious. And then it will change my behavior, and I can work on a downward spiral. But just the ways you can work as a downward spiral, you can also work as an upward spiral. So you can kind of recognize how you're feeling in this present moment and push that mental pause button to say, okay, how likely is this thing that I'm worrying about to happen? Maybe it's quite slight actually in reality, or maybe my thinking is disproportionate. And as we, through mindfulness practice, create these positive, these calming neurochemicals, then we start to build this sense, this upward spiral of, I feel better. I feel better. So I think, actually, I'm thinking better about my health. And I now feel that I can exercise. I now feel that I can do the things I want to do. And by doing exercise, it helps us release cortisol, so we feel even better. So it's a great place. And whilst most of the studies are around a 12-minute meditation, it can be as little as 2 minutes at your desk, just focusing on your breathing, following your breathing for 2 minutes, and it can really help ground us. Focusing of the sensation of your feet on the floor or standing, or maybe even laying down, the sensation of laying down. Just 2 minutes enables us to reground and almost reset where we are.
So in terms of our everyday lives, from what you're saying, it seems like if we're in a state of heightened anxiety or stress and the limbic system is engaged, or our monkey mind, as you've described it, we are more reactive. We're less conscious in the decisions that we make. We don't pause, or we're less likely to pause to reflect on our words or our actions. We're less able to concentrate. Whereas if we are practicing mindfulness, we are more likely to be able to develop a space, and which would enable us in turn to make more mindful decisions in every aspect of our lives. Is that right? To live in a more conscious way.
Absolutely, and it's very much about living. We talk about being mindful as a thought process, and being much more conscious and more aware. And it really is that building that awareness of how we choose, what we choose to do. We kind of like to think as a human race that, as intelligent people, all of our decisions are made from the cognitive part of our brain. But in many cases, our behavior is driven by the limbic system based on how we feel about things. And then we rationalize it with our brain. So if we lose the capacity to recognize those emotions for what they are, and they're providing us data, they're providing us information, and it's only when we can really tune in to say, oh, that's interesting, how am I feeling today? And what information is that providing me? And if we can really then recognize that information that's providing, then I can choose how I want to respond. Something the late Dr. Stephen Covey talked about in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about stimulus and response. And by mindfulness, what you're doing is you're increasing the gap from having a stimulus to how you choose to respond. If we're very fragmented, very stressed, then it becomes this. And within that limbic system, we have something called the amygdala. And people will talk about amygdala hijack. And that is where something happens and we respond. We may well regret it afterwards, but it's instantaneous. And that is where there's no gap between stimulus and response. But by continuously practicing for short periods of time mindfulness, we're growing and growing this capacity to see things more clearly and choose how we want to respond.
And I suppose really, that's developing that ability, which we all have. We're all born with it. We just lose it, don't we, in the busyness of our lives. But if we can develop the ability to make decisions more consciously, if we can widen that gap so that we've got time to recognize what's happening to us, make a decision about what we should do in response, and then respond, that skill is highly effective in improving parenting, isn't it? But at the other end of the scale, highly effective in the boardroom.
Absolutely. So what you're doing, again, there's many studies, the work from Daniel Goleman around emotional intelligence. So as a society, we've always valued IQ as being key to success, and it starts in children at a very young age, that we drive them to be very academic. We want to build that IQ, and our IQ develops up approximately to the age of about 17. It doesn't significantly change past that point. Our emotional intelligence, or EQ, develops throughout our life, and it grows and develops, but we can actually learn and further develop it. And mindfulness is a great way of helping us develop our emotional intelligence. But here's the thing, what the studies have shown is that in senior leadership roles, so you touched on the boardroom and senior management roles, 15% of your success is down to IQ, 85% is down to EQ. And if we look at all kinds of jobs, non-leadership roles, still 66% of your success is down to emotional intelligence and 33% is down to IQ. We need that to get us into a job to a level and to have a certain capacity. But actually, it's things like interpersonal skills, it's the social skills, it's being able, our impulse control, it's our empathy, it's our stress tolerance. And we can develop, if we become more mindful in how we're feeling and how we're responding, then we start to have a greater insight, and we can then develop these skills to become better in all aspects, whether it's as a parent, that we are more mindful in the way that we're parenting, or whether we're a manager or a colleague or a peer or a leader. It can make such a significant difference in the way that we live our lives.
And I'm sure all of us as parents, as we obviously both are, and all the parents watching will understand and have their own experiences of being really short with your child, and afterwards just thinking, I should have stopped, I should have tried to think about what was going on for the child, I've made things worse, or a situation develops very stressfully within the household that actually doesn't need to be there, if only we'd just paused to think about how we responded to our children. And of course we teach our children, don't we, by our behaviour. If we're responding in that way, we're teaching them, particularly up to the age of about 7, we're teaching them that that's what to expect, that's how life works, and that's how their relationship will be with their parents.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think there's a number of things there. Most of our core values and beliefs about the world develop between the age of 4. So as we're parenting, this becomes the view or the lens that children see the world through. Parenting is really interesting, because if anybody that's been a parent that potentially with newborns or sleepless nights with children, we all know that if we've had 3 nights of not much sleep and being woken up, we're not making the best decisions, and our patience becomes much shorter because we're sleep deprived. And that's a natural thing. I think another challenge with parenting that really fits with mindfulness is that sometimes we tend to judge ourselves against other parents, or and it's easy to judge our children against other children. And it's this part of then placing these judgments and self-critiquing, which just adds pressure and load. So sometimes it's about being a bit kinder to ourselves and saying, am I doing the best that I can do in this moment in time? And what do I need to do to step back to do the best that I can do? Because that, in that moment, is all that's important. And again, that's something we can strengthen through, mindfulness practice to regulate, yes, how we respond. Are we making the best decisions? But also sometimes to let go of some stuff. I'm not perfect and I didn't get it right, and that's okay, because I'm doing the best that I can do at this moment in time.
Paul, you mentioned the fact that a lot of people will think, I'm too busy for mindfulness, I haven't got time, or those people who are in that situation are arguably those who would benefit from mindfulness most, aren't they? How can we, as busy people, busy individuals, parents, working parents, whatever our role might be day to day, how can we integrate mindfulness into our lifestyles?
So you're absolutely right. It's not necessarily all about spending hours meditating. When people are starting, I usually suggest that they schedule it as part of their day. So even if it's to start 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the evening, to try and find that time slot. And for some people, it may be when they're working, they say that I'm going to constantly take a break for 2 minutes, just have 2 minutes breathing at my desk. But there are other things that we can do. So most of the science is based around the meditation, in terms of physically changing the structure of our brain. But sometimes going out for a walk, whether that's in the morning, a certain time in the day, and really taking that walk mindfully. And what I mean by that is really tuning in to the sensations of walking. So how does it feel as each foot contacts the ground? What's the feeling of the air on your face as you walk? what can you smell in the air, and what are you seeing? And when we really start to observe things that are really happening and unfolding within that moment, I've had people come back and say, wow, I really didn't think this could make a difference. I've been out for a walk close to my own home, and I've seen things that I've never seen before that have clearly been there, but I've started noticing. And this is really where we're building this awareness and we're making choices. I always say it's a little bit like if we practice regularly, we start to see the world in full HD color, as opposed to we're so busy, we're almost watching it in black and white or grayscale, because it's fragmented. We're not getting the full picture. We're not allowing ourselves time to really absorb what's happening around us.
It's interesting that you use that analogy actually of high definition color versus grayscale, because practicing mindfulness regularly, particularly sort of gratitude meditation or those, or journaling positively, or small activities like that done daily and done regularly, really do improve our sense of happiness and well-being, don't they?
Absolutely. So I mean, the journaling is another nice point as well, that there's proven studies. The work of psychologist Martin Seligman in both his books Authentic Happiness and Flourish, he talks about keeping a gratitude diary. And it's quite interesting. I've had a coachee that I've been working with for a number of weeks, and I talked to them about keeping a gratitude diary, and I said, look, this is just 5 minutes at the end of your day just to find one or two things that you're grateful for. And on Friday they said to me, well, to be quite frank, I was really quite skeptical. How can writing down a few things that I'm grateful for really make a difference? And I said, I've now been doing this for 3 weeks and I feel completely different. I feel completely different. Again, they described feeling quite stressed, quite irritated, quite fragmented in their thinking, and struggling a little bit with lockdown. And they said, actually, there's so many things that I realised that I appreciate, but I now feel calmer and I feel more content. And nothing physically has changed in terms of the environment around me, but in the way I'm thinking and reflecting, it's made how I physically feel change.
Somebody that I was working with and made the same suggestion to had, through the process of journaling, come to recognize how blessed he was in having positive things constantly around him and in his life. So for example, he came to this by he believed that he was supposed to think of new things every day. And when we reviewed, we had a review after a week or so, and he had explained that, you know, he already felt that he was worrying because he was going to run out of positive things to write down. And we then were able to have a discussion around, well, what would you, if you didn't, you know, don't put these boundaries around what you can write down, just write down what you feel gratitude for in that moment. And in doing that for the following week, he recognized that he was really grateful to have a consistent and stable marriage. He was really grateful to have a comfortable home. He was really grateful to have use of a car. He was really grateful to have the opportunity to eat a varied and healthy diet. And these basic things, you know, air to breathe. Today it's sunny. You know, those really basic things that we take for granted, when we're living more mindfully, they really come to the fore, don't they? And bring us the happiness that we actually crave, that is already there for the taking.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all of these things, and that critical part creeping back in is a key part that we're now doing something, and then we start critiquing ourselves. And so this point about being non-judgmental, actually, I can be grateful for the same 3 things every day. That's absolutely fine. But going back to this specific question around the time, it can be short periods of time, so you can schedule it in. And what I would say to people is, if you genuinely cannot find 5 minutes in the day for yourself, then something needs to change. Because if no matter how busy, how important what we're doing right now feels, if we was to jump forwards and let's say we all live a very long life, and you're to look back and what was the legacy that you want to leave, and how do you want to have lived that full life? And at the moment, if you don't feel that you have 5 minutes to yourself at all to do anything, and you're frantically moving through it just to rush to an end point, then I would suggest we're not really living our life. We are just racing through it. So
without noticing.
without noticing. Yeah. So sometimes to say, actually, if this is really important to me, maybe I do need to find. And yes, of course, we all have days. So if we set ourselves, we're going to practice mindfulness for 5-10 minutes a day. We're going to spend some time doing a journal. And one day it doesn't happen because you do. Again, we don't need to judge ourselves. We can be kind to ourselves. Say that's fine. It's not now that I've fallen out of the habit. I can do it again tomorrow. But if there's too many days where we're not making that time for ourselves, then that's time for change. And I think through lockdown, people maybe have had a period of stopping, actually, for a forced stopping to be a bit more in the present moment and reflect. But the point is now, I believe, shifting the agenda that we're seeing around, I guess, mental ill health, that people feel that they can talk about stress and anxiety, to really push towards mental well-being and mental fitness. We know for many years the importance of physical fitness, but now to prescribing mental fitness rather than starting from a negative position. We don't wait until we have an injury, a physical injury, to start to strengthen ourselves by going to the gym. We take regular exercise. And I think now it's about developing this muscle of mental fitness, because we are living longer, but the quality of life and how much you really truly live that life depends on how we look after our mind as well as our body. And there's really 3 parts. It's our physical body, there's our mind, and then for many people there's a piece around spiritual well-being. And that's not about religion, but it's about what's the purpose in my life, that bit of spark. And if we feel aligned spiritually, and we physically look after our body and we look after our mind, then we're much more likely to lead a fulfilled life.
You mentioned that the greater awareness of mental health and well-being is just really coming to the fore. Over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been quite a focus. Our children obviously will have the benefit of that, insofar as the culture is shifting whilst they are still young, and hopefully they will grow up within an environment where it's acceptable. There's no stigma attached to mental health and mental health issues. But how can we introduce the concept of mindfulness to our children? How can we encourage them to live in a more mindful way?
Yeah, and there's a number of things. So I wouldn't recommend some of the longer mindfulness meditation for children. Concentration can be a little bit more tricky, particularly with younger children. But actually, one of the things where their mind's becoming overstimulated is a common parenting problem. We have so much electronic devices, and this technology is great, and particularly through lockdown, it's allowed children to stay connected with friends, and these can be useful devices and shouldn't be stopped. However, some of the simple things around doing some mindful colouring, so actually spending some time to slow down and to do some colouring, doing a jigsaw puzzle whilst we're using our mind but in a much slower way, can be really useful for children. And also, if we want to introduce them to some very simple mindfulness meditation guiding, actually allowing them to take a bit of time out, lay on the floor, to put their hands on their tummy and just notice their tummy going up and down with the breath. And we might do that for 30 seconds or 1 minute. And by doing this, it's a great way of just calming body down, and maybe even introducing some minor parts of body scans. So what can you feel in your toes right now? Do you have tingling feelings in your toes?
And kids are remarkably good at doing that, aren't they? They're so much more connected still to what's inside of them. It's sort of almost like they haven't separated yet, as us adults have.
Absolutely. So they can be so much more in tune. If you go out for a walk with a one child, you'll notice how they're wowed by everything, the bird in the tree, whatever it may be. And all of a sudden we kind of take all of these things for granted. And actually, if you take a small child on a warm day to get them to walk barefoot on the grass, or whether they're walking on a beach, on the sand, and really noticing the sensation of walking on the grass or walking and the smells outside, they're much more inclined, because they are a sponge. They're learning, they're developing, and it has the newness, and then slowly we become occupied with other things, and we start to become busier and busier, and our world, through technology and the needs, is speeding up, but only we can kind of slow ourselves down to say, well, I now need to take a pause to regroup and refocus. But if we start developing some of these habits very early with our children, whether it's a very short, just following our breath at our belly, or going out for a walk and just seeing what we notice, or spending that little bit of time colouring, are great ways just to start to create that brainfulness. And the difference that's often misunderstood with children, particularly if we take a photograph of a 2-year-old child's hand and we take a picture of an adult's hand, broadly it just looks like a much smaller version. If we take a picture of a 2-year-old's brain versus an adult brain, they are significantly different. It hasn't developed in the same way. So by developing, as their brain is growing, this mindfulness approach to be able to concentrate and to be focused, you are building them those skills where, in terms of whether it's regulating their behavior, because we know as teens go through that period, they have very little control over emotions. And this is because their brains are still developing and hormones are rebalancing. But if we build these skills, it can help. It's not a cure or a silver bullet for everything, but it's something, it's a tool that we have which will help with our development.
A nice thing I've started doing with my 9-year-old is, before bed, it's sort of a comparator really, I suppose, with a gratitude journal, but just is to talk about what was her favourite thing that's happened during the day, or what's the thing that is making her feel happiest today, and just to sort of instill that habit of feeling gratitude at the end of each day, and reflecting on all the positive things that are around us. There's lots that can be done, isn't there?
Absolutely. And if we're having those conversations, we tend to get what we nurture, and if we nurture things, what we're grateful for, what we're thankful for, what we're enjoying at that moment in time, you'll tend to find that will grow and flourish. And if we're much more focused on what we don't have, what's going wrong in our life, then that tends to be that's what will grow in our life, because that's what we're nurturing.
That's what we're expecting. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. I can't tell you how grateful I am to you for taking the time to come and speak to us. We've learned so much. I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions flooding in, and I hope it will be all right to contact you if anyone would like to work with you further, or discuss anything that we've touched on today in more detail. Perhaps you'll come and see us again.
Absolutely, no problem at all. An absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Day,
Thank you very much. You too. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Right, just stop the recording.